My name is Avery Gardner, and I'm the chairwoman of the Student Advisory Committee here at the Institute. I'm also a junior here at Harvard. The IOP is very pleased to be hosting tonight's panel and the entire Youth Vote Conference. As many of you know, our mission here at the Institute of Politics is to encourage undergraduates and young people to pursue their interests and actions in politics. And I can't think of any other way to best do that than to encourage young people to participate in politics through voting. We're honored to have such a distinguished panel with us here tonight, and I thank you all for braving the snow to come down here and join us for the evening. I can promise you a very exciting event and a very interesting discussion. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you the Provost of Harvard University, Albert Carnesel, who would like to welcome you all on behalf of Harvard University. Thank you.
Thank you, Avery. Well, it is my privilege to welcome all of you here on behalf of Harvard University and on behalf of the John F. Kennedy School of Government. I observed that it's been 25 years since the passage of the 26th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. And so this is particularly appropriate at this time. Let me read to you Section 1 of this amendment, which has been in effect since 1971. The right of citizens of the United States who are 18 years of age or older to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of age. Well, it took us almost 200 years to figure out that that was a smart thing to do, but we did get around to it. So the role of youth in our political process, not only as general participants, but as voters, is a relatively new phenomenon in the United States. Why is it important for young people to get involved in this process, in politics and in public service more broadly? You can go through a long litany of reasons, but it seemed to me there were a few that stand out. First of all, there's no better source of idealism than that of young people who want to do what's good and do what's right and won't take no for an answer and don't start out with, well, we always did it this way before. Let's do it this way now. So idealism. Second, energy. Just extraordinary energy. I don't mean just physical energy. Mental energy, emotional energy, and that's what makes our political process work. Third is a fresh perspective, a different way of looking at things and how we govern ourselves in a democracy. And finally, of course, you're the ones with the largest stake in our future. And so if anyone has a right to participate in our process, and if anyone has enormous stakes in what our future is and will be, it's you. Now, this is a wonderful panel tonight. They're going to be introduced by others, but I should say, first of all, Clay Mulford has been here at the school before. As I understand it, he's on his way and is going to get here. George Stephanopoulos has also been at the school before. We're always eager to grab him whenever we can, and it's a little easier when there's a primary in New Hampshire, because if you look at the map, it helps if you're going from Washington and New Hampshire, and we threaten to shoot down the plane if it doesn't stop at Logan. And Joe Malone, the treasurer of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, just a terrific citizen and leader, and wonderful of him to join us tonight. Now, our moderator tonight is Therese Helicheur, and I'm delighted to turn the program over to her. Welcome to all of you.
Thank you, and I want to welcome all of you here tonight coming from across the country to join in increasing youth voter participation here at the Institute of Politics, and definitely want to thank the Institute and the Kennedy School of Government for hosting us here tonight, as well as several of our funders and coalition members, including the Heinz Family Foundation and the Cummings Foundation, for having a commitment to our generation. As was recently mentioned, this is the 26th or the 25th anniversary of the 26th Amendment that first gave 18-year-olds the right to vote. And as you may know, 92 saw the largest turnout of 18 to 24-year-olds since we were first given the right to vote in 1972. And this presidential election is the first presidential election that we have had since a few things have come into effect, one of them being the motor voter bill. This gives us the right to register to vote when we get our driver's license or when we go to social service agencies, and has put millions of new young people on the rolls to be registered voters. So I think with that, I think the challenge before us is to make sure that we actually get out and vote. This is also the first presidential election that we have had since this increased access to the internet that we see before us, and it's definitely something that we as young people have more access to and are using in greater numbers than ever before. It's also the first year, the first presidential election since an unprecedented coalition like Youth Vote 96 has come together to increase youth voter participation. And so I think that this year is going to be a very historical year with all of these historical landmarks, and I think we'll see the greatest increase of youth voter participation that we have ever seen in this country, and we will really set the standard to the rest of our nation that America should be using its democratic right and get out there and vote in huge numbers. And I think it's one important point to bring up is that young people are motivated by issues more than any particular party affiliation. I myself did not want to be engaged in politics at all until I realized that the issue I cared about, which is the environment, was being addressed by our politicians, and realized that in order to affect that issue, I need to get involved in the political process. And I think a lot of us here in this room feel that way, and I think that is one of the goals that we see before us as we get out there to engage our peers in this process, is that we want to be engaging them in all the issues that they're concerned about. I want to take a moment just to introduce briefly all of our distinguished panelists and then do more formal introductions when they actually come up to the podium to speak. And we will have a period for question and answers, or questions. And you should go to either mic, and we will take your questions accordingly. And please make sure that you address your question to a specific panelist and try to keep them brief. We are joined tonight by State Treasurer Joseph Malone, and we really thank him for coming out here at the last minute, braving the snow with all of us. We also have the honor of having George Stephanopoulos, the Senior Advisor to President Clinton for Policy and Strategy. And we do know that Clayton Mulford's plane has landed and that he is on his way. He is one of the founders of United We Stand America, and he will be joining us hopefully very shortly. So I will start with my introduction for Joseph Malone. He's the State Treasurer. He is a good friend of the Institute of Politics and has joined us here many times in the past, and is considered a Republican leader in Massachusetts for the last decade. He has been the chair of the Reagan-Bush campaign and is currently the chair of the Dole campaign here in the state.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here, and I want to congratulate the Kennedy School for sponsoring this event. I was out picking up a takeout order with my 6-year-old son about 2 weeks ago, and we got the pizza, and we were on our way out the door, and a constituent stopped me and wanted to chat a bit, and he was actually very complimentary, so the conversation went for about 2 or 3 minutes. And as we got into the car, my son said to me, Dad, do you have to talk to everyone we meet? And I said, well, these people, Joey, they vote for me, and if they don't vote for me, I don't get elected treasurer. So he said, I don't understand. They have to vote you in? I said, yeah. In fact, last time around, just 2 years ago, that's what happened. He said, well, how many people voted for you? And I said, about 1 million people. He said, how many people voted against you, that you shouldn't be treasurer? I said, about 500,000 people. He said, 500,000 people didn't want you to be treasurer. Now, the next thing he says, of course, is, well, when do you have to run again? I said, well, we have something called term limits, and you can only run twice, and I've already run twice, so I can't run again. He says, that's the dumbest idea I've ever heard of. Now, I was one of the champions of term limits in Massachusetts, so I said, please, Joey, don't ever say that in public. Now, a day went by, and my 4-year-old son, Sam, then goes to my wife and says, I'm going to run for treasurer, Mom. I've made up my mind. And she said, well, why are you going to do that? He said, well, Daddy's going to be out of a job in a couple of years, so I figure I need to... Well, at any rate, the point I am trying to make here is that at a very early age, I think we're all touched by politics, some more than others. And in my case, I grew up in a household where I was the youngest of 7 children, and both my parents were born in Italy and came to this country as young children. But they had a feeling that the way in which Italian Americans, and for that matter any other American, were going to have their voice heard was through political activism. And so at the dinner table, just about every night during an election cycle, that was the topic of conversation, what was on the news from a political standpoint. And in this day and age, I often wonder, A, because families are so busy and that nightly business meeting that used to take place around the dinner table doesn't take place as often, and B, because politics seems to be, in this day and age, so oriented toward advertisements and oftentimes negative advertisements. I wonder what children and young adults are starting to sense and starting to develop in terms of a political acumen is. And I hope that organizations, particularly campaigns, do a better job of reaching out to young people than I think they've done in recent years. Now, there's always the case where a campaign does an outstanding job, but I fear that all too often in this day and age, the key is raise lots of money, get your message on the air, try to knock down your opponent's stature as much as you can, and then try to get as much earned media as you can. And I do think that every elected official who's running for re-election, every challenger who's trying to attain a position in government ought to recognize what Al said, and that is that a tremendous amount of idealism, a tremendous amount of energy comes from youthful voters. And to not have that piece of the equation involved, to not have that group of citizens involved in our electoral process is a loss more than just the simple fact that they're not getting out to vote. So again, I commend all of you for being here tonight. I'm probably preaching to the choir, but I would hope that any way you can get more people involved, particularly in campaigns. I hope you'll do it, because once an individual gets involved in a campaign, I think they look at democracy in a very different light. And I think it, on the whole, is a plus that they were part of that campaign. And then, in many instances, they go out and find other peers to get involved in the political process as well. So again, I thank you all for inviting me here, and I look forward to a very good give and take. Thank you.
So as you probably guessed, we have been joined by Clayton Mulford, so we're glad that he made it. Our next speaker has been instrumental in engaging young people in the democratic process, and his political strategy and leadership has definitely been an inspiration to many young people. George Stephanopoulos is the senior advisor to the president for policy and strategy. During the '92 presidential election, he served on the Clinton-Gore campaign as the deputy campaign manager and director of communications, and ran the now famous War Room with political strategist James Carville. George Stephanopoulos.
Thanks. Thank you very much. It's great to be back at Harvard. The dean was teasing me. Every time I come back to Harvard, I get this sense memory of great anxiety, because it was here in October of 1991 where Bill Clinton first insisted that he was going to allow gays in the military. It was the right position, but it caused heartache for us for the next year and a half. Joe, it's great to hear about Joey. I think he's a Democrat at heart, and we want to bring him. I also want to thank you all for still having me here. I mean, I passed a great milestone this week. You know, all these polls always group people by ages, right? And the big one is 18 to 34. And I had a trauma this week because I turned 35, and now that I'm in middle age, I'm glad you'll still have me here. You know, I'm up here this weekend for partisan reasons. I'm here to try to re-elect Bill Clinton as president, just as we did in 1992. But I think the work that... Yeah, you can clap for that. That's okay. What they say about Harvard is true. We love it up here, right? But what you're doing here is transcends any partisanship and is just as important as anything we're going to do this week. And in fact, it's more important. And let me begin then, and I hope I don't get any trouble back at the White House for this, but let me just say from the start that do everything you can to get people out to vote no matter who they vote for. You know, I don't care if you get more people to vote for Pat Buchanan or Bob Dole or Lamar Alexander or any of the Republicans, or if Ross Perot gets back on the ballot. I hope you'll all vote for Bill Clinton, and I believe he's earned the votes. But it is critical that we reinstill faith in the democratic process in this country, that we make people believe that their vote matters, that it makes a difference. And every single election that goes by where you see votes go down instead of up is another blow against that faith and is another blow for cynicism, and it can't help solve any problem in the future. You know, in 1992, we did try very, very hard to get the youth vote. The president went on MTV, went on Arsenio Hall, he went on rock radio, he did college town hall meetings, and it was the right thing to do. Because one of the things we've learned over the last several years is that it's not only important to speak to issues that matter to young people, but you have to speak to them where they can hear what you're going to say. You have to speak to them where they live. And if you look at all the statistics right now, fewer and fewer people every year are getting their news from newspapers, are getting their news from the television news. And more are getting them from the internet or from talk radio or from college newspapers or in a million other different ways. And it's important that you reach people where they live. Now, I can sit here and make a case for Bill Clinton because I think he's the best on the issues for young people. I think he's the best president for the future to ensure economic security for every American, especially those who have the future generations who will have to bear the burden. I think he's the only candidate who is focusing on education and the importance on education in the future and opening up access to college education and ensuring that everyone has the skills they need to get a good job. I think he's the best candidate for the environment, the best candidate to lead America into the new century, and I think he's got the best chance to bring this country together. And we're going to be making that case for the next several months, and I hope all of you that clapped can go out and make that case as well. But just as important is the kind of message the president talked about at the back end of his State of the Union. You know, Harvard has a great professor named Robert Putnam, who's written a book, a study called Bowling Alone. And I see some of you nodding your heads. And what did he talk about in that study? He talked about the fact that all across America now, there's not only declining faith in government, but there's declining faith in all of our institutions. And fewer people are now getting together in their communities and in their churches and in their synagogues and working together to solve common problems outside of government. But you know what the difference is? You know who put the lie to that general trend? It's young people. Even as voting patterns are declining, although we did get a bump up in '92, and we're very proud of that, more and more people, young people than ever before, are volunteering in their communities, whether it's through the great program here in Boston called City Year, or through the President's AmeriCorps program, or a host of other programs. Keep clapping. I seated the crowd. This is great. More and more people are coming together than ever before to volunteer in their communities. And I remember reading about a seminar here at Harvard probably about a year ago where a young woman was praising this, but sort of deriding the political system. And she said something like, we're the boring generation. We don't have any wars or large causes. All we have to do is fix things up. Now, it is critically important to fix things up. It's essential. And it's really important for all of you, if you can, to go out and serve in your communities and help knit this country together and do that important volunteer work and do the important work that needs to be done to build the next generation. But don't believe the lie that says that the other half doesn't work, that government doesn't work, that government doesn't matter, that voting doesn't matter. Voting is the way we elect our government. Government is the way, whether we like it or not, that we come together to solve common problems. It is the way, it is the only way to do that. You can't simply make government the enemy and hope that it goes away and assume that the country will be educated, that the economy will be well run, that the foreign policy of the country will go in a direction that you want it to go in. And not voting is not an answer. Not voting does not say, oh, the system stinks and I'm not going to have anything to do with it. It's abdication. It's walking away from the system. You all know that. That's why you're here this weekend. But you have to spend the rest of the year making sure the rest of the country gets that message. One of the last things I did before I came over tonight was to watch the news. And the first 3 stories that are on the news were about how people were turned off by the New Hampshire primary, on how fewer and fewer people were going to vote. And you might have a right to be mad about the negativity of the campaign, about the negativity of all the campaigns, or about the fact that politicians sometimes don't seem to keep the promises they made. But not voting is not going to be the answer. And by rewarding the negativity that you feel by walking away will only encourage it more in the future. And in the end, all it is a vote for the status quo. Governing is hard. It takes a lot of work. We learned that in 1992, and I know that after a lot of young people voted in 1992, they got a little bit discouraged in 1994 and didn't come out because all the results didn't come right away, and they don't come right away. But the only way they're going to come over time is when we vote. That is the genius of our system. It's the genius of democracy, and it's the only way it's going to survive for the next century. Thanks very much.
Our next speaker was a leader in the political campaign that shook up the American electorate in '92. Not only shook up the youth vote, but other constituencies as well by having the independent alternative. Actually, a poll recently that Youth Vote 96 released showed that 67% of young people would consider voting for an independent candidate in '96. Clayton Mulford is a partner in the Texas law firm Hughes and Luce. In '92, he was the general counselor and campaign manager of Ross Perot's presidential campaign and is a founding director of United We Stand America. In addition, Mr. Mulford is a fellow here at the Institute, or was a fellow here at the Institute of Politics, and we're excited to have him back again.
You got me all excited with that little slip. I thought maybe Terry was going to give me a nice announcement tonight and tell me I was coming back. But I had a wonderful time here last semester, although I left in the same weather as I arrived tonight. And there's some elements of Texas, even though I'm not a native Texan, I've lived there for a dozen years. And there's some elements of it that it's hard to believe are preferable to Cambridge. And one is that I was running at noontime today in 70-degree weather. I agree with what both of the prior speakers have said, particularly George, on the youth vote. But I think it's particularly important, at least to point out a couple of things. From our perspective, or my perspective as kind of a centrist, independent-oriented person, the fact that the youth vote is disproportionately issue-oriented, disproportionately independent, disproportionately untied to a party makes them disproportionately of interest to me. The 1992 vote for Perot, the youth vote was his strongest category by far. It was 25%, which is his worst category was with people 65 and older. I think those two things are tied together, at least we'd like to think so. One, not being tied to parties. Two, being issue-oriented. There was a Lou Harris poll done about 2 weeks after the election that said which of these three campaigns did you feel was most focused on the issues. And in that poll, Perot got 43% of the vote, and we were as proud of that as we were of the 19% for the actual election results, because it was the plurality. But in 1992, as was mentioned, about 43% of what are called young voters, and unlike George, I've passed the precipice for the general category, although there's one other that goes to 44, so I've got about 5 more years on that one as an age bracket. But the 43%, which represented an uptick in 92, is really just symptomatic of the whole populace voting in greater numbers in 1992. And in 1994, it fell down to 20%. It also, in both 92 and 94, was the lowest proportion of any bracket of the population measured by age. So it's not a number to be particularly proud of, and we should do everything we can to try to get more people to the polls. That's why one of the positions in our campaign was in favor of motor voter, and coincidentally, majority of motor voter registrars appear to be registering as independents, which is good news. So I have an interest as much as those that voted, as much in those who didn't vote as those who did. And there are a number of studies. The Putman article that George mentioned is one. I hear a new one is an updated analysis is coming out on that by him. But there was a study done by UCLA of 250,000 Generation Xers. I don't know where they fit into the 5 groups of the polling entities divide the population into, but they're on the younger side. But of that 250,000 young people, the statistics were a little disturbing. 30% follow politics compared to 60% 30 years ago. 16% consider politics important or relevant in their lives versus double that in the late 60s. Those are very disturbing trends. And then there's spin that's given to that. Either these people grew up under Reagan and they're cynical, so now they're not involved, or their professors here are PC, and that's alienating them from being involved. But both of those things are, I think, inaccurate. I think George has touched on the answer. There's a higher degree of volunteerism and involvement among Generation Xers, according to the Kettering Foundation, than any generation previously in the last 40 years. So what it means is people are volunteering to work in soup kitchens or volunteering to help build a house, but they're not volunteering for a political campaign. And you wonder why that is. And I think it has something to do with the way the process of politics work and what's been going on in politics for the last 30 or 40 years. And I think that I would put it into 2 categories. One, there's a polarizing element occurring in the political landscape that's been going on for 10 or 15 years with the rise of professional campaign techniques and so forth. And with that polarizing, you have more extreme views in both of the parties. The parties are dominated by ideologues, by people that are electrified, energized by politics, like many of the people probably in this room. But we tend to have more extreme positions, my current company accepted for myself, than the population at large. And whereas 25 or 30% of Americans may consider themselves strong Democrats or strong Republicans, the vast majority are non-ideological, are pragmatic, are issue-oriented, are economic moderates and social moderates. The vast majority at the center of the spectrum are not well represented by the polarizing nature of the political parties. The second point that I think leads to this alienation with the political process is the process of politics. And I divide that into 2 categories. The first is the way we finance it, which wags like me would say produces a direct result in the way the economic matters of the country are determined. And that is where we bundle together the interests of the state and the financing of Congress. And it's sort of interesting, I think, that the majority of PACs and public interest group interest lobbies and business lobbies all had an epiphany this past year in 1995 and decided they were now Republicans, are going to give a majority of their fund giving to Republican rather than Democratic congressmen. Huge differentials. But today, a majority of congressmen, a majority of incumbents receive a majority of their funding from interest groups organized in Washington during the legislative cycles when the fundraising occurs. That produces, a lot of these groups have very laudable goals. A lot of them I've contributed to, the Sierra Club, the Association of Hungarian Nurses, whatever it is, they have a very narrow gauge focus. And you have the development almost of a system some people call the rise of interest group pluralism, where one group is going to balance the other. So if it's coal mining, you call in business. And if it's labor union, you get a counteracting view on the environment from somebody. But the people that have the greatest amount of expertise or paying the greatest amount of attention to the legislation on the Capitol Hill are also the people funding the people voting on that legislation. The rest of us are kind of left out of the process. The other side of that is that the process, the science of politics that is funded by this mechanism doesn't do anything to involve or educate the people on the issues. All it does is really alienate them from the process. The typical campaign policy is to develop a strategy, do some polling, see how that will play, do a focus group, what buttons do we push, do some opposition research, see what we can do to drive up someone's negatives, run some ads, how are they playing, do another poll, do another focus group. I've never seen a poll or talk to a pollster or a person selling media advertising that didn't tell me, well, you need more polls and more media advertising. And the whole thing kind of drives in itself. They reached their zenith or nadir, I guess, in the 30-second ads, which fortunately I think are becoming bad politics finally. So what young people can do is to say that since we are issue-oriented and are independent-minded and are not tied to the party, are not ideologues, is to look hard at the issues that are presented and make people take positions on issues that are relevant. And there's some that are particularly important. In fact, the most important issues facing the country, I think, today are tied directly to new and first-time voters, and they have to do with the structure of our economy. You know, we think that, you know, as the debate goes on in Congress now between the Republican and Democratic Congress, that the problem is the them, that, you know, we're going to cut or squeeze them, foreign aid, the underclass, the military. The real problem with the economy is us. It's middle-class entitlements. That's where all of the there's another independent here. I didn't know Harvard would let into. I've lost my thought here for a second. But the problem with the entitlement program is Social Security, unfunded federal pension funds, and the Medicare-Medicaid system. And it has to be fixed. It has to be addressed. Everybody knows it, but it's demagogued as a political issue. People are afraid to talk about it, afraid they'll be pillared, afraid they'll lose election because one of those 30-second ads will run saying that someone's threatening to take away their Social Security. But the truth is, unless something is done about it by the time you're 50 or 40, you're going to be paying up to 55% of your income in Social Security and Medicare taxes. That's before federal income taxes, which would take it to 80, 85%. That simply can't happen. If you don't do that, interest rates will go sky high. It's very questionable whether that's possible, given the fact that there would not be an appetite for the commercial paper of the United States. In other words, something has to be addressed, and there are proposals afoot that can fix it, in time, raise the age for Social Security recipients by the year 2014 to age 70, test it by the wealth of the individual receiving it, and subjecting it to taxation up to 85%. That will make the whole system solvent. And everybody, I think most people are aware of that but don't want to talk about it. So your job is to get people out to register to vote and to give politicians cover when they want to take positions that need to be taken that are politically very difficult because they'll be pillared under the process of politics now, which should be the next objective to fix. Thank you.
So we now have some time for some questions, so if people want to approach these two mics on either side of the aisle, and if you could please identify yourself and where you are from and address your question to a particular panelist. We'll start over here.
Good evening. My name is Ayana Loney, and I'm a freshman here at Harvard. And I enjoyed the panel quite a bit, but what I think one of the questions that wasn't really addressed was, although I was not old enough to vote in the last, at least presidential election, many of my friends were. And since that election, over the past 4 years, I think a lot of that faith and excitement that was inspired in young people has kind of fizzled out because young people have lost faith in the government. I mean, they finally did go out and vote and nothing seemed to happen. But I'm wondering, and this question is addressed to anybody who cares to answer it, how do you think the government or politicians or whoever can now, I guess, rebuild their faith in young people?
I'll go first because we made a lot of those promises, and I just don't buy the premise that nothing happened. For young people, we promised to sign a motor voter law, and that's what the president did. We promised to pass the Brady bill, to have a waiting period before you purchased a handgun, and we promised to ban assault weapons, and that's exactly what we did. We promised to cut the deficit. It's come down 3 years in a row. We promised to expand student loans. There's now a national direct student loan program in this country. We promised an AmeriCorps National Service Program. The president signed it into law. We promised 100,000 police. The president signed it into law. We promised to cut taxes for working people, and he signed a law that cut taxes for 15 million working people earning under $25,000 a year. We promised to increase funding for Head Start and WIC. I could go on for a long time. The problem is not enough people know that. Not enough people believe it happened. but it is true. And I think sometimes it's a bit of an easy out to just say, oh, nothing ever works. You have to work a little harder to get the facts. We have to do a better job of it. I plead guilty to not doing a good enough job. But the fact is, if you stack up the promises the president made, particularly to young people, and what he's actually delivered, it's a remarkable record on just the things I mentioned right there.
I would just add that regardless of the age of the citizen, I think there is a certain impatience with democracy, and coupled with the fact that the media is more inclined, and I don't want to make this into a media bashing session, but the media, all right, go ahead. But they're more inclined to tell you the story of when government fails as opposed to when it works. And in our shop at the State Treasury, we've reduced our operating budget by 50% from where it was in 1989. But when a reporter comes into our office, usually they're looking for a mistake that occurred as opposed to, gee, let me tell the public about how they're getting more value for their tax dollar. And I think all of us in government understand that it's our challenge to get our message out. But my message to you and any other citizen would be, you need to read between the lines sometimes, and you need to go the extra step. If there was a candidate that you supported and you think they've let you down, well, then by all means, don't continue to support them. But on the other hand, pursue the situation to the point where perhaps you will find out that they did follow through, if not on 100%, maybe at least enough of their promises so that there's a reason to feel optimistic that the progress will continue.
Okay. Go ahead.
Good evening, and thank you for coming. My question is directly for Mr. Stephanopoulos.
Can you identify yourself, please?
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Tad Brown. I'm a freshman at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. Thank you. You spoke in your speech about Putnam's Bowling Alone, and my familiarity with that piece was from a class in which I also read Democracy in America by de Tocqueville. That piece made me decide that things like working in soup kitchens, helping your neighbors and stuff like that is as important, if not more important, than things like voting and preserving democracy in America. However, that doesn't mean that I don't think going out and getting people to vote is important. It's very easy for me to say, I want to go to New Hampshire and get all the kids to register to vote. We're all going to go out and do it. The difficult thing, and this is my question, is when it's me with another high school student one-on-one who's maybe doesn't have the political interests that I do, watches football games, goes to parties, has to do homework, fight with his parents. How do I say to him, register to vote, take the time to register to vote, take the time to educate yourself about the issues, then take the time to go down and vote, when it's really hard to see the tangible returns from your one vote out of the thousands, unlike working in a soup kitchen where you get to see that face to face?
I wouldn't. Those are two great things. Don't put them in opposition to each other. Working in a soup kitchen and voting, they go hand in hand. But if you care about the people that are affected by that soup kitchen, then the national welfare policy is going to affect them as well, and the national homeless policy is going to affect them. The national health care policy is going to affect them. Everything that we deal with in government is going to determine what's happening in that soup kitchen as well. Now, it's far away. And it may seem like the direct connections might not always be apparent, but the consequences of not voting certainly are. The only other thing I would say is that, I'm not sure if this was de Tocqueville or Jefferson, but he also talked about the habits of democracy. And the habit that drives you to a soup kitchen, the altruistic habit, is really one of a kind with the habit that drives you to vote. It says something about taking care of the broader society, of thinking about problems outside of yourself, and they really do go hand in hand. So I would make that argument. Don't set up the false fight between volunteerism and voting, because in the end they're going to hurt each other.
Thank you. I may add, you mentioned the instant gratification of working in the soup kitchen that you work in. In politics, sometimes it can be an unpleasant process if you allow it to be. I can remember a campaign manager once saying to me, gee, what we really should do is on Patriots Day get a bunch of young people and have them march out to Concord and collect signatures on their way in support of your candidacy. And I thought, you're not going to get anybody to help you that way. Now, what we did do was we ended up doing social events at $5 a piece, and before you knew it, the first event was attended by about 75 people, and then it grew, the second one, the third event, and that was our front porch into our campaign. And if we had a front porch that was so unpleasant looking that people just didn't want to get involved, then we would have been just running against the tide. So as a tactical matter, anything you can do to make the political process a fun one, to get people to take the first step, by all means do it. I mean, the bus campaign that the Clinton campaign ran last time, I thought was nothing short of genius, because it got people feeling a part of an old-fashioned style of politicking. And anything else that can be done like that, by all means, go ahead and do it.
It's Craig Greenberg, and I'm a law student here. And my question is also for Mr. Stephanopoulos. Last night, I understand on Larry King Live, you identified who you finally now believe is the author of Primary Colors. And I'm curious as to what, if you believe you have the right man, what your reactions to the book were, and if you were surprised that so many high-ranking Clinton supporters in '92 spoke so wonderfully of the book that doesn't seem to paint the prettiest portrait of Mr. and Mrs. Clinton.
I'm sick of this book. First of all, it's a book that is uncannily accurate on very small things and wrong on all the big things. I think that's the safest one-sentence description. I really don't know who wrote it. I wish I knew, but I don't know. Whoever thought of to market it as anonymous is a brilliant marketer, and I'd like to have him come work for the campaign and help us market the president. But in the end, it is a novel. And I think the less I say about it, the better.
My name is Jeff Yarbrough. I'm a freshman here at the college. Mr. Stephanopoulos, you mentioned earlier in your statement that the '92 campaign was very much directed towards young people with the MTV and the Arsenio, and led by yourself and the ever-entertaining Mr. Carville. And then there's also the added excitement with the third-party element. Do you think that there's any chance of regaining that excitement in this '96 election that looks like it's going to be the incumbent president and one of our elder statesmen, possibly Mr. Dole?
Maybe some third-party candidate. You'll have to ask Clay. I don't know. Well, I sure hope so. You can never, recreate history exactly. I wouldn't try to. And, Joe's right about the bus trips were terrific. Whenever you do something like that the first time, the second time it seems more like a gimmick. So maybe we wouldn't try it again. I'm not saying we won't, but that's just one of the dangers that we have to think about. I think the president will rekindle that excitement, but it'll be in a different way, and it was on the model of what he did in his State of the Union. And it is a less political approach, a nonpartisan approach, and trying to talk about the big challenges the country faces, and trying to talk about how we can work beyond government and work with government to solve our problems. I think it's going to happen. Whenever it gets closer to Election Day, I think that the excitement comes back because it is a big choice that really matters. And I just hope that a lot of this ugliness of the primary season doesn't close people's minds completely before we get to that general election.
Let me just add to that, just as a point of clarification. My recollection is that President Clinton's weakest group was first-time voters, young voters. Isn't that accurate? I think it is, and the strongest group was over 65. But he's still got, I think, more of them than anyone else.
Well, okay, but weakest relatively, but we had more absolute numbers of all voters, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that proportionately, your weakest element in the population were young voters.
I'll stay out of this, except that I would add, though, Ronald Reagan did extremely well with younger voters, and
he did.
He did.
And that's what George was the first people to break into that. You did less well with them than others, but you did better than preceding Democrats.
Right. Yeah, I guess I can't argue with you. It's just we got more 18-year-olds than all of our opponents, more 20-year-olds, more 30-year-olds, more 40-year-olds, more 50-year-olds.
Go ahead.
All right. right. Thanks a lot for coming tonight. My name is Jason. I'm a junior at Georgetown University in Washington, D.C. I think you've all done a really good job of explaining, especially Mr. Stephanopoulos, why we should vote, why the youth should go out and vote. What I have failed to see from Mr. Mulford and in the 1992 election is an appeasement as to how you plan on getting voters, youth, to come out and vote. And I'm curious what you might do in the coming year to get young people to come out and vote. Not the why, but the how.
The how. You know, we in '92 didn't target any specific groups of any nature, so youth were not excluded from that. And there is no plan now to target any specific groups or arrange for bus tours or anything of that nature.
So you have no plans to get to come out and vote in the coming year?
I suppose we have the same plans as anyone else. That is what we hope, that the number of voters increases, that participants.
Yeah. Thanks.
If I may touch on that for a second, I think young voters in particular, but voters in general, don't want to be faced with the choice between raising taxes or slashing services. And I think the candidates who go out there and find innovative ways to solve problems without reaching back into the pockets of families and individuals who are already paying up to 40% or on average 40% of their household income to the government, those are the candidates who are going to attract the support of young people. And I see it every day where people say, geez, don't tell me I have to turn my back on someone who may be down on their luck, or someone who needs a college education and a hand to achieve that college education, or someone who wants a first-rate education or to live their senior years in dignity. And that's what we need to do. If you want to energize any group of voters, find a way in which to figure out that balance. And I like to think that in our Treasury shop we've done that in our own little world. But that, to me, is the key.
Yeah, let me add, too, that, you know, I thought you were talking about the events that they were discussing, but the Reform Party has registered a significant number of new first-time voters, and they get the majority of them on college campuses. The University of Maine, other universities there throughout California. That's considered the most fertile ground to discover new voters and to find voters that are willing to register into new parties. So there was a major effort that way, but there's not an organized effort to involve people abstractly, other than trying to show the importance of the issues that are to be decided upon by Congress.
So we only probably have time for several more questions, and I know there's a lot of people lined up. So if we could try to keep our questions short and directed to a specific panelist, we could get through more of your questions. Go ahead.
Hello, my name is Greg Field. I'm from UC San Diego, probably the only one here from California. No, got a couple? All right. My question is rather similar. Specifically in California, we have quite a volatile electorate right now. Being that over the last several years we've had issues like Prop 187, to issues specifically affecting students, like limiting our ability to lobby using our own money with the whole Smith decision, which I might add is being overturned right now by the University of California Student Association. As well, over the last several months, Wilson, as you know, has been quite upset about the whole motor voter issue. And my question is with all these issues that are quite divisive in the state of California, what do you see as a good platform, policy, type value platform that can effectively unite the youth population and bring them together after all these divisive issues have quite silenced our vote?
Do you have a particular speaker that you want to answer that?
You can put that to Mr. Stephanopoulos and then whoever else would like to.
Yeah, it's going to be the campaign we run in California, and there are three issues: education, and the environment, and the economy. And you know what we like about these issues, and I like to call them web issues as opposed to wedge issues. The wedge issues, we know what they are. It's going to be immigration and affirmative action. And the Proposition 187, and now there's probably this California Civil Rights Initiative, which would just end affirmative action. it is going to pass, or at least be put on the ballot in California. And those are issues that do divide people. Everybody is affected by education, the environment, and the economy. They have to bring people together. You know, when in the affirmative action issue in California, while they're debating whether or not to dismantle the affirmative action program, the problem is that college tuition for every single student in the state of California is going up, and there's nothing on the ballot about that. And that's an issue we have to address in the campaign, and we're going to try to focus on those issues. The president was against Proposition 187. He's against the Civil Rights Initiative, and he'll state his opposition. But more important, we think, is going to be his positive agenda on those three issues.
Go ahead. My name is Jackie Shapiro. I'm a freshman at Georgetown University. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for coming. I'm a government major, so this is completely exciting for me. But actually, my question is directed at Mr. Stephanopoulos. We talked a little earlier during one of our other panels about apathy, about a lot of student apathy on campuses in particular. And this year, I don't know how many of you know, there's a big controversy over the cutting of financial aid. And Georgetown helped to organize a rally on Capitol Hill, and of the dozen or so D.C. schools, about 2 of them took any part in it. My question is, beyond voting on November 3rd, if someone asks me, what's the difference? I can vote for who I think I like, but in the end, no one listens to us anyway. And I want to suavely say, well, I asked Mr. George Stephanopoulos this question, and he said, how do I tell them that their voice makes a difference, and in what way could I tell them is the best and most effective way to have their voice be heard by the President and by Congress?
That's a good question, and there are a lot of ways to have your voice heard, particularly if you're in Washington, D.C. You might not believe this, but if you write a letter to the editor of the Washington Post, there's a pretty good chance the President's going to read it, and he'll scream about it an hour later. He does. He gets all these clips, and he circles them and sends them back, and it sounds silly and it sounds small, but it makes a difference. I mean, even things like a letter to the editor, you know, the President of the United States can read it, and he can set a lot of machinery in action to get something done, and he's done that a lot of times. I think you have to ask your friend or tell your friend, you know, what's the alternative? You know, if you don't vote on the things you care about, say financial aid, then you know those who organize against it aren't going to stop. You know the people with money organized to block it, say the banks, who are trying to stop the student loan program, are going to organize, they're going to buy their ads, they're going to lobby the Congress, they're going to make their contributions, and they're going to get what they want. Now, voting may not be a perfect answer, it may not be immediate, but you know the consequences of failing to do it. And again, it's hard to do it in the general, but if you go to your friend and say, what are the issues you care about, I would hope that if you look back at what we've done, they would say, at least we've tried and tried to make the difference.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
My name is Dominic Perry. I'm at the University of Maryland in College Park. I'm also with a group called the National Association of Graduate Professional Students. My question is, I think, is kind of a follow-up on this last one, because a lot of what we've heard today about talking about young voters is trying to come up with strategies to say to them, well, you know, this system is not immediate. You don't always see immediate results. You have to be patient. There's no other alternative. You know, vote or not. You either vote and participate, or you don't vote, and that's even worse. But I think that there's at least a part of the group here tonight and a larger group on campuses around the country that say, is that the only alternative? And meaning, what about, it seems like what we're told is, this is just the way the system is. And it is large, and it is impersonal, and it's about power, and it's about money, and it moves slowly, and it's not always responsive. But I think what there, at least among some folks, there's the feeling that, well, does it have to be that way? And I think to the Perot campaign in '92, which, although obviously it would be have some difficulties, the idea of the electronic town hall, the idea that there would be a way for more direct participation, the idea of getting big money out of politics so that the common citizen feels more of that he or she can be on more equal footing in these debates. And I'd like to, whoever would like to pick up the question, to talk about not necessarily how do we convince people to be patient with the system, but what can be done to change the system.
Well, I think that the technological advances are very promising and a cause for great optimism as far as people's ability to follow and monitor what's happening in Congress, for people to be informed. And the true key here is the sense of accountability in Congress. If someone is interested, like the woman from Georgetown was, in student loan programs and so forth, right now it's somewhat cumbersome to follow that kind of issue. In 10 years it won't be. It'll be very easy to communicate also with all your congressmen by pushing a button or getting the White House position or George's positions on an issue or the Republican position. And I think you're going to get a lot of access to information. What that does to you, sitting at home in your room with piled up information from Mr. Putnam's perspective, who knows? But I think from a political standpoint, it's very positive because the sense of accountability will be spread farther and flatter than it is now. Parties have traditionally been hierarchical, and they're being flattened first through direct election, through primaries and so forth. And I think that process will continue, and that's a positive thing.
It's happening already. Right? We have a homepage on the internet.
Yep, so do we.
The speaker does. Yeah. But I'm going to say something. Maybe I think there's a good argument for more electronic town halls, more direct communication. But I also, this might not be politically popular, but I make a small plea for gridlock.
Want me to say it then?
Right, exactly. A plea for gridlock. And that's why the Constitution was written. That's what the system of checks and balances is about. And, it works both ways. A lot of, I was disappointed that the Republicans in the Congress blocked the president's health care plan. But it was, their way to make their voice heard. But I'm awful happy that the Constitution provided for a veto and two-thirds override when the Speaker came forward with his budget this year. I'm really glad there was gridlock this year. So, it works both ways, and in the end, I think that the kind of system that the framers set up does work best. You don't always want to have everything move so quickly, and I think you could make an argument, and it goes back to the argument about polling that Clay was making, that maybe the system at times is too immediately responsive, that members of Congress react too quickly, or the President reacts too quickly to the latest polls or the latest positions, when some more reasoned judgment over time will lead to a better policy. So yes, we need more direct communication. Yes, we need more town halls. Yes, we need more computer access. But sometimes haste isn't the best policy when you're making government policy.
In response to the point of how do you let people know that they shouldn't be discouraged or shouldn't throw in the towel on democracy, in my lifetime, I'm 41. First there was, in my lifetime, a civil rights struggle that I witnessed every night on TV, and then the Vietnam War, and then Watergate, and then beyond that there were recessions and fear of a nuclear holocaust. And so we're certainly not in a situation where for the first time in our lives as a nation we're looking at some challenges. The answer is, though, do we just step aside and not address those challenges, or do we become active enough to make sure that the beliefs we have end up becoming part of public policy? And that's why this is such an exciting time for any young person to get involved in public life, because this isn't the time when you're being a caretaker in government. This is a time when you're part of that changing world out there that government is such a huge part of. And again, in my 5 years in government, and it's my first tour of duty, but there have been some terrific battles that we fought with people who wanted to do things the old way, people who wanted to allow lobbyists to drive the bus versus doing the right thing. And at the end of the day, when you win that battle, it feels real good. And maybe in the big scheme of things, it's only a little speck, but that little speck then starts to roll into a bigger speck.
So we only have time for 2 more questions.
My name is Jeanette Galanis, and I'm president of the U.S. Student Association located in Washington, D.C. And first off, I'd like to say to Mr. Stephanopoulos, I really commend the president for his leadership shown in the last 7 months, in particular on July 17th, coming out with his speech in support of affirmative action, which we understand is a very divisive issue, but is the second largest access to education issue that we have. And secondly, I'd like to commend the president on his leadership shown in the budget reconciliation process in saving the direct lending program and other financial aid programs. And to top it off, to making education a very large campaign issue, which we're going to go to the polls in November, which brings my question to Mr. Mulford. So
that makes sense.
Completely. I talk a lot to students and organize with them every day, as a matter of fact. And one of the questions that we have, especially in light of the whole political landscape for the last several years around deficit reduction, Social Security, is that my membership in particular has said Social Security is the scapegoat to this issue. The real issue is federal budget priorities, which, in my opinion, the independent party has not addressed in terms of investment programs like education, Medicare, and Medicaid. Can you please address that?
That's you've hit on a very important problem. Just to make sure we're on the same wavelength here, the reason that Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid have to be addressed is because of their size in comparison with the rest of the budget. And you can't address the issues without addressing them. But you've hit on a very important point, and that is, if things are managed for the long term rather than the short term, that frequently means you need greater investment now, in people particularly. It makes a lot more sense to raise the age for Social Security or Medicare, Medicaid, not from those who need it, but from those who don't, and put it towards prenatal care or care age 0 through 5. Money spent on that or on education is a good investment over the long term. And the way we manage the economy now, we don't make those decisions over the long term. That's why it's possible that you need to raise taxes. And in 1992, part of the campaign platform was to raise taxes, to address the deficit and also to make investments in people, but as an effort, as a long-term, wise economic decision.
Thanks. That's what I wanted to hear. Thank you.
I just want to, on behalf of my parents, on behalf of the President, thank you for your statement. On behalf of my parents, I have to thank you for that great Greek pronunciation of my name.
Okay, and our last question.
Hi, my name is Therese Helicheur, and I attend the State University of New York in Utica, Rome, and this is directed to Stephanopoulos, if I said that right. Everybody's talking about how we've gotten, or the motor voter registration has gone through, and now everybody can, have, it's accessible and easier for younger people to vote, also through social services. But what are the plans, just to give somebody the power to vote, but what is the plans to educate those people on how to get through the rhetoric to actually not just register to vote, but actually go out and vote, especially for not so much people who are freshmen or attending higher learning, going through a higher education, but especially for those people who aren't planning on attending college, but just graduating high school, and where do they fit in, and how do we, as maybe a community, start educating them? Not only they have the right to vote, and maybe they are even registered to vote, but are not using that right because they don't know the system.
That's what campaigns are all about. That's what all of us are paid to do, and that's what we're going to try to do in the campaign. I can say what we're going to try to say across the board is that we believe the President's agenda for meeting the challenges of education and the economy and the environment are the only way you're going to be able to secure your future. Now, we have to make that case in a million different ways. And as I said, I think one of the challenges we have is to find new ways to do it, to find innovative ways of getting that message out in a way that is both heard and believable. I think Joe pointed out in some ways these ads may be getting less popular, and they may not work the same way they used to work, and we might have to look for different avenues. And one of the most effective ways we found is that people are more likely to believe information if it comes from someone they know. So we're going to try to do a much more intensive grassroots effort simply to get out information in the old-fashioned way, and we hope it's going to work.
I would just add that in last night's debate, I thought probably the most interesting idea that got discussed was the idea of saying to candidates, If you want to have TV ads, well, you have to be the spokesperson, excuse me, in that ad. And I think by doing that, you would take away a lot of the negative message and a lot of that hard-hitting message, because any pollster, any consultant will tell you that a mean-spirited message coming from an individual who then wants to be well-liked just doesn't work. And if we ask those candidates to deliver their message as opposed to having this voice from the heavens saying so-and-so is a bad guy, then I think our system would be better off for it.
Also, those... I agree completely with that, and that kind of proposal is part of two bills currently pending in Congress on campaign finance reform to require the candidate to actually appear in the ads in order to get the ads at a reduced or free rate, which should, one, lower the need for raising money from special interest groups, and two, improve the tenor of the debate. So I agree.
Great. Well, I want to thank all of our distinguished panelists for joining us tonight.